Hi folks, welcome to part 2 of painting this Necron Royal Warden miniature. If you haven't seen part 1, why not go back to check it out to learn how to paint this grim dark metal carapace. In this video we're going to be focusing on the red energy bayonet on this model. It was painted at the same time as the rest of the red on the model, but to keep things nice and easy to follow, we're just going to focus on his bayonet. So without any further ado, let's cue the music. The first step is to give a nice smooth even base coat of deep red from scale 75 all over his bayonet. I'm not being particularly neat on the bayonet, but I am being careful to not get any of the red on the previously painted metal areas. And don't worry if you do, you can always go back in once it's dried with some of your base colour metal tone. And thin this down enough on your palette so this should cover in about 2 to 3 nice thin coats. If you don't have the scale 75 reds, Corn Red from Games Workshop will be a good alternative here. For the next step, I'll be using Blood Red from scale 75 thinned down with a little bit of water on my palette. With this colour, I'm going to start building up the transition colour between the dark and the light red tones on the blade. As you can see, I've painted in about the front third on the top layer, a little bit underneath it on the lower side of the blade, and I have painted the back quarter at the top. What we're going to focus on is making sure that there are light areas and dark areas opposite each other, and that will help build up this contrasting non-metallic metal look. The next colour I will be using is Antares Red from scale 75, and once again it has been thinned down on my palette. And just like the previous step, we're going to be using this over a couple of layers to build up the colour, but with each layer that we do, we focus on a slightly smaller area to ensure a nice smooth blend between the colours. If I painted about a third of that front blade with the last colour and then built it up so it's about half covered, I'm then going to cover about half of that area again with this new colour, getting a nice solid finish. The trick here is to take your time and not get phased by the fact that you have to do several thin coats to build up a blend. Once you are happy with the colour transition from your previous colour, you can then come in with Aldebaran Red from scale 75. And we're not covering much with this paint, we really are just picking out the edges of the blade and those final little bits to the most intense corners of the red. And if you've taken your time and built this up in layers, you will really start to notice a nice smooth transition, especially if you have a really bright red against a really dark red opposite each other on the blade. You will really get that lovely contrasting sought after non-metallic metal finish on your energy bayonet. Although I've been using scale 75 reds in this tutorial, the brand of paint doesn't really matter. You just want to have a nice selection of reds that go from a dark red to a bright red and slowly build up layers and transition between the colours. The real secret with this is just to take your time and build up the layers slowly. I've left these all playing at full speed so you can see exactly what I'm doing with my brushwork. We can also take this opportunity to really reinforce our brightest red by applying an edge highlight. An edge highlight is a really important step in all non-metallic metal effects. And what I'm doing here is focusing on where the light source is going to be the most intense. So I have done it right across the upper edge of the blade. And in that area underneath the tip of the blade, where we've got that small area of red with the darker areas on either side, I've done a thin straight line down the middle of it. You should always do the edge highlight across those areas that you have done in your darkest colour as well. That extreme contrast between the dark and the light really helps this effect be sold and really stand out on your model. Next, we'll be coming in to emphasise the lightest points on this blade using Mars Orange from scale 75. With this colour, I'm being really particular where I place the highlights. For this, I want this colour to be the absolute reflex. I don't want to go overboard with this, as I don't want to turn the blade orange, I still want to maintain that red colour. I will paint this on the uppermost edge of the blade and where we want our strongest reflex highlight to be, such as in this bit on the lower half of the blade where we have that red bit between the two darker areas. I'm also doing a very careful line to separate the upper and lower half of the spear point at the front of the blade. I am leaving these at full speed so you can see exactly what I'm doing with the brushwork and where I am placing my highlights. Although with most edge highlights you do need quite a steady hand and to be very careful with your motions, don't worry if you make a mistake or the line is too thick for your desired look. Just wait for the paint to dry and go back in with the previous colour and rebuild up the blend. If you're using the scale 75 paints and following along with this tutorial, these paints are really forgiving as they are very transparent in nature and really do benefit for those who are looking to make a way into blending with their paints. As an optional extra to take your blade just that one bit further, you may choose to do some dot reflex highlights on the corners. And to do this, I have mixed in some white into the Mars orange to get a nice sort of peach colour. And with this, I'm using a very fine tip brush and I'm picking out some of the sharpest corners and doing a little bit of scratching onto the blade. The trick with this is to not do too much, maybe pick out the corners if you're not confident in doing this. Generally with this effect, less is more. It's very easy to go overboard on this. Our last step is to really reinforce the shadows on this blade. It can be quite easy, especially if you're doing lots of the orange and white-orange mix reflex highlights, to start to lose something of the deeper shadows. And to do this, I have taken matte black from scale 75, thinned it down quite heavily on my palette, and I'm glazing this into the deeper shadow areas. And to soften out the transition between the red and the black, I'm making sure that the brush is wet after applying it and using a backwards and forwards motion, feathering out the paint and the dried areas so that we get a nice smooth transition between this black shadow we're reinforcing and the rest of the blade. Now this is a very good thing to do if you've lost that contrast from the dark to light, but this is an entirely optional step. It depends on the aesthetic that you want to go for. And with this step, it's just about going into the darkest areas opposite your brightest highlights, very slowly, very carefully, applying a little bit of paint and using the wet brush to feather it out into the rest of your mix. And don't worry about speed, just take your time and get a transition that you're happy with. And with that, the red non-metallic metal bayonet on this Royal Warden is now complete. Now don't worry, this is part 2 of a tutorial series, so coming up next we will show off the glowing red parts on his gun and the glowing effect in his chest, and then later parts will cover the gold copper effects on the rest of the miniature. So why not subscribe to the channel for further updates and notifications when those videos are produced, and to follow along with the rest of this tutorial series. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time, folks.